In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Blasphemous Beastmaster build. This is a level 100 build that's a Strength Faith build that takes advantage of the Beast Incantations that you'll find in the game. So the way this build kind of started was that I was looking at the Bestial Incantations, trying to figure out how to make them deal maximum damage, and kind of going from there. I did some experimentation with some different seals, and I basically figured out that it doesn't matter specifically what seal you use for Bestial Incantations. Depending on what your setup is, it'll change which is best for you. But if you're doing a split strength, split faith setup, the Clawmark seal is going to be the one to go to for you. If you're doing like a pure faith build, this will obviously not be the case, and you'll get more damage out of the Bestial Incantations by just playing, with a regular S-scaling faith seal. And you can also use the Clawmark seal with like full strength, and you'll do better than you would if you were using, any other faith seal that has S-scaling. So if you're doing like a full-on strength build, or you're doing a strength faith hybrid build, the Clawmark seal is the way to go. Talking a little bit more about that, I basically found that if you're going to be using the Clawmark seal, then you definitely want to do some sort of split between strength and faith. If you're going full strength, you'll still have fairly good damage on your incantations, but it feels like your damage as you get above 50-ish in terms of strength, it starts to drop off, and the same is true for faith as well. So if you're splitting your stats between those and you have like 40 of each or 50 of each, you're going to come out better than if you go like 80 in strength or 80 in faith. So trying to bring them up, somewhat close together will actually outperform going heavy in one stat or the other. Of course, the exception here is if you want to just play a pure strength build and you want some incantations to back you up, you can get damage out of it that way. However, for this build, I was trying to get maximum damage out of the Bestial Incantations, so I went for a Strength Faith split setup. So I used the Clawmark seal, and I was trying to figure out, okay, so I have split Strength Faith. I need to find a weapon for this build, and so the natural choice would be some sort of weapon that scales off Strength and Faith, which is how I ended up with the Blasphemous Blade. Not only does this weapon deal incredible damage, but it fits very well with this setup because of the way our stat spread is. We have a lot of mind, we have a lot of strength, we have a lot of faith, so you can use the ability of this weapon, which hits like a truck regularly, and it just works really, really well for this build. Additionally, because the weapon art is so strong, you don't really need to dual-wield greatswords with this build in order to get good damage, especially if you're just using that ability or you're finishing something off with a swing. So kind of the playstyle with this build is using the Bestial Incantations at range and then using the Blasphemous Blade to sort of supplement that as necessary, instead of leaning into like a greatsword playstyle or dual greatsword playstyle and then using the Bestial Incantations as necessary. We're sort of going with Bestial Incantations first and then Blasphemous Blade second. I also want to mention that the weapon art for Blasphemous Blade Taker's Flames does 100% fire damage, and the weapon itself deals physical and fire damage. So if you get into a scenario where fire damage is resisted heavily, like in Volcano Manor, for instance, having a backup, something to deal damage that's not fire damage, like the Bestial Incantations, works very, very well. Besides that, we use the Cincadia Dagger in our offhand. This boosts Bestial Incantations by 10% roughly. So basically the setup is you'll have the Sacred Seal and Blasphemous Blade in your right hand, and you'll have the Cincadia Dagger in your left. And then when you go to cast spells, you'll swap Blasphemous into your seal, and then you'll two-hand your seal. The reason you want to two-hand your seal for this build is because the strength scaling increases when you two-hand by 1.5 times, and that is actually applied to your incantation damage in this case. Other seals that have strength scaling when you two-hand them, the strength scaling only applies to meleeing with that seal, but in this case, it actually applies to the incantation damage, so you want to two-hand your seal when you can in order to get maximum incantation damage with these spells. Note that it will also apply Cincadia's damage to you while you're two-handing the seal, as long as it's still in your offhand. As far as armor goes, it's not super important what you use here. Again, you want to be able to medium roll and have maximum protection that you can get with this build. I like to use the Omen Smirk Mask here because I kind of feel like it fits the theme, but also because it gives 2 strength, and we need all the stats we can get for this build. It doesn't have any negatives. For talismans, I have the Ritual Sword Talisman, the Dragon Crest Shield Talisman +1, the Green Turtle Talisman, and Radagon Sword Seal. Radagon Sword Seal is pretty much a must for this build at this point in the game. You have a crazy stat spread with this build. You need strength, you need faith, you need mind, you need endurance, you need HP. So having to spread your stats around between basically 5 stats is very, very difficult to do at level 100. And Radagon Sword Seal basically frees up some stat points to be used in faith and strength in order to increase the damage of our incantations and Blasphemous Blade. I'm really hoping that I can pull this out on the level 150 version of the build because I really don't like having things in my build that increase the damage that I take. However, it's going to be tight even, I think, at 150 to get the stat spread that we need, but we'll see when we get there. We have the Ritual Sword Talisman here. This gives you increased damage with your spells and Blasphemous Blade when you're at full health. What's really great about Blasphemous Blade is that when you kill enemies with it, you gain 6.5% of your max HP back, so it's not going to be hard to keep full health with this build. And if you're using an incantation like Blessing's Boon, then you'll just further keep your health topped off, which is great. Dragon Crest Shield Talisman +1 is there to increase your protection. You're going to take increased damage from Radagon Sword Seal. This is here to sort of offset it. You also don't have a lot of endurance because your stat spread is so crazy, so you're not going to be able to wear very heavy armor, and this will help give you some decent protection. Green Turtle Talisman is there because when you're spamming Taker's Flames or the Stone of Gronk spell, you chew through your stamina, and it's really the one determining factor that's going to stop a spam down. You typically don't run out of FP before you run out of stamina, so this is there to regenerate stamina faster so that you can get back to flinging rocks faster or spamming Taker's Flame, like during boss fights. The incantations that I use for this build are Bestial Sling, Beast Claw, Stone of Gronk, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Golden Vow. Golden Vow is there to increase your damage from all sources and reduce the damage that you take, so that's good. You're going to try and keep this buff up 100% of the time while you're running around, just fighting things in boss fights. Flame Grant Me Strength boosts not only your physical damage and your flame damage, the Bestial Incantations all deal physical damage, so this will boost their damage as well. And Blasphemous Blade deals fire damage and physical damage with its regular attack, so that's going to boost it 2 ways there, even though Taker's Flames is only fire damage, but you'll still get the boost from fire damage from Flame Grant Me Strength there. Stone of Gronk is kind of your go-to ranged spell with this build. I feel like it out-damages the other spells significantly. You can chain it very, very quickly, and it's just really, really good. It also does strike damage, which is a very effective damage type in the game, particularly against enemies that are like, really resistant to other types of damage. I feel like strike is really, really good against them, like the gargoyles and things like that. So it's good to have another damage type. Bestial Claw just doesn't deal the damage that Stone of Gronk does. It was very, very powerful in the beta, but it's just not as good as it was. It's good for AoE, though, like if you're AoEing on horseback or if you're AoEing in general. If you need some AoE, this is pretty good. The Stone of Gronk has like a small AoE with its explosion when it hits, but this is a much wider AoE, so it's good for that. And finally, Bestial Sling is kind of a spammable, close-range, like fan-like ability. Again, it's good for AoE and for large enemies. But generally speaking, if you're close to an enemy, you're going to be, with this build, you're going to be meleeing them with the Blasphemous Blade or using Taker's Flames. Otherwise, you're trying to stay at range with them so that you can use something like Stone of Gronk. You can also add other incantations to this, like Blessing's Boon, to get a heal over time because you're using the Sword Ritual Talisman. But these are just kind of the ones I feel like are a must. So generally, the way this build plays is you're going to keep up Golden Vow as you move around the landscape, and you're going to be flinging rocks at people with Stone of Gronk. Usually that'll one-shot regular enemies or two-shot other enemies, and sometimes you'll run across some difficult enemies that'll take more, but you're generally trying to play at range while you can. Make sure that you're two-handing your seal while you're doing this if possible to help increase your damage. Then if you encounter an aggressive enemy or an enemy that you just can't, range down with Stone of Gronk, you're going to switch to Blasphemous Blade, and you can either use Taker's Flame here, or you can just melee generally or run and jump. I like jump attacks with this too. They're very, very good. But that's kind of there for situations where Stone of Gronk just isn't getting the job done. When you go into boss fights, you probably need to assess before time or, do some trial and error to figure out, like, what a boss is weak to. If they're weak to fire, you want to run in and spam, Taker's Flames as much as you can in order to just melt them really, really quickly. But if they're not, then you want to use Stone of Gronk and just try and chain this to stay at range. You can even use this point blank if you time your rolls correctly. And it's just a really good all-around spell. So that gives you a ranged and close range option if you don't want to use Blasphemous Blade. So you kind of just need to deduce, like, what's the strategy of the boss and figure out which one of those is going to work best for you in that situation. I try and default to Stone of Gronk when possible, but there are some scenarios where Blasphemous Blade is just better. So my stat spread for this build is 35 Vigor, 30 Mind, 21 Endurance, 40 Strength, 17 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 40 Faith, and 9 Arcane. Keep in mind that Vigor, Endurance, Strength, and Dexterity are all boosted by 5 each thanks to the Radagon Sword Seal, and Strength is also boosted by a further 2 points thanks to the helmet that I'm using. So 35 Vigor is probably, right around the minimum that you want for a melee type build. This is not necessarily a melee build. It's kind of like a melee hybrid build. So I think we can get away with 35 Vigor there, but I don't think you're going to want too much less than that. 30 Mind is there because you spam spells with this build. Not only do the buffs cost a good amount of FP, but Stone of Gronk costs a good amount of FP. Taker's Flames cost a lot of FP. And you want to be able to use these as much as you want. And you have lots of blue flasks, but you want to make those blue flasks, last longer. So increasing the mind stat here really helps with that. Endurance is just enough in order to use the armor that we're using in still medium roll and use the weapons that we're using. This may vary a little bit depending on the armor that you're using, but make sure you don't have any more endurance than you need at this point because your stat spread is already crazy thin. 40 strength and 40 faith are there to increase the damage of your incantations and also to increase the damage of Blasphemous Blade. So this is a really good stat spread for this. One of the reasons I wanted to use Radagon Source Seal is because it freed up basically 10 points for these stats that I wouldn't have otherwise, maybe even more than that. Getting that damage as high as you can is important. I'm hoping that once we get to 150, I can pull that out and we'll still be able to boost these stats a bit to further increase damage because these can't stay there as you progress the game. 17 strength is enough to use Blasphemous Blade. You actually only need 15, but my class started with 12, so there's kind of 2 wasted points there. They go into Blasphemous Blade's regular physical damage anyway, so they're not a total waste, but otherwise they're not super useful for this build. You don't want more than 15 dexterity if you can get away with it. Arcane and Intelligence are not needed for this build. I just happen to have 9 of these each from the class that I selected. And one last tip for this build before I wrap up this video. If you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique for boss fights, I feel like you need to change it up depending on what your strategy for the boss is. I generally default to the Faith Knot Crystal tier and the Green Burst Crystal tier in order to increase Faith, which will increase the fire damage of your Blasphemous Blade as well as its ability, and it will increase your incantation damage, so that's good. And the Green Burst Crystal tier increases your stamina recovery by 30%, and that does stack with the Green Turtle Talisman, so that'll help you increase your stamina back faster so you can spam spells faster in boss fights. However, if you go into a boss fight and you know they're weak to fire and you know you're going to be spamming Taker's Flames during that fight, I would swap out one of those for the Fire Shrouding tier in order to increase your fire damage for a good 3 minutes. That'll be a better bang for your buck in that fight. So that's kind of, situational, but you'll want to swap those up. Otherwise, default to the Faith one and the Green Burst Crystal tier. Also, if you are going into a fight that you know the enemy is weak to fire and you're going to spam Taker's Flame, you can swap out something like the Dragon Crest Talisman or something like that for the Fire Scorpion Charm to increase your fire damage even more. As I mentioned, Taker's Flames is 100% fire damage, so that's going to benefit that substantially. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring builds as we wrap up our level 100 builds this weekend and head into our endgame 150 version next week.